just sort of close this sort of the talking at you part of this session with a brief summary of another function of UBDC. We've heard a little bit about some of the research activity that's going on. We actually have a dual function. We also operate a national data service. And I think, given the accounts we've just heard, we hope that to be able to position the data service, and I'll introduce it in a moment, as a means to kind of amplify some of these benefits, to find out a way to get data from organisations that own it but perhaps lack the capacity to really capitalise on it into the hands of researchers who can actually transform that data into information, into evidence that can support decision making, inform policy, and ultimately affect change for the better. I will be reasonably brief here because we want to fit some questions before we break for light refreshments. But yeah, so we are not just a research centre at UBDC. We're funded, perhaps should have introduced our funder already, we're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, which is a primary funder of social science research. But as well as being funded as a research organisation, we're also part of the UK's research infrastructure and charged with the responsibility to build data collections and to make data available and to facilitate access to data, lower the sort of barrier to entry for data-supported work for researchers in a much more general sense. We work with a lot of different organisations in pursuit of that goal. This is some of the public and third sector organisations with whom we have either data sharing agreements to take their data and make it accessible more widely, or that we have supported with the availability of data or associated services. However, as I'll kind of introduce, it remains a challenge, an ongoing challenge to find the opportunities to build these kinds of partnerships and to develop them in the kinds of ways that we've already heard this morning. We also work with a range of private sector and business organisations too in pursuit of a very similar goal. So working with these data owning organisations, coming up with agreements, taking their data, enhancing it, describing it, making it discoverable to support primarily academic research use. We do so with a very, very flexible approach to reflect the sensitivities of particular data, to reflect the questions or the perceived risks associated with making data available. So sometimes that can be more strictly limited. In the case of the previous example, of course, with the North Lanarkshire data, we could be very aware with the real richness and the power of that data comes a selection of kind of risks and perhaps people's initial instincts would be to think about some of the privacy considerations. So obviously controlling the access to that data, offering the appropriate reassurances, ensuring compliance with any kind of legislative or other requirements and expectations is pivotal and important in coming up with a sort of a trusted relationship to make data available. So some of our data can be open. Some of it can be what we call safeguarded, where there are restrictions in place and users have to sign up to licensing agreements. Others can be much more controlled, where we're limiting access both in a very physical sense to particular environments, where outputs and outcomes are strictly controlled and disclosure controlled, for example, to ensure that there's no privacy or commercial sensitivities that are compromised. And we can therefore sort of adapt our agreements, adapt how we operate to reflect the specifics of the data or in individual agreements. Some of the available data we have already at present it includes things across education data sets, transport data sets, we have health data, meteorological data from a range of different data organisations, retail, commercial data. We're trying to build a very widespread selection of data that really reflects specific researcher needs across the sort of questions around around cities and how cities perform and behave. To offer you a little indication of the scale of our service, we're supporting around sort of almost 800 users at present. Just sort of something in the region of 2,345 data sets have been requested, and although our primary focus is UK academic audiences, we have a real international selection of requests and of users of our services. But data acquisition is what I want to sort of talk about, and I'll sort of summarise what some of the big problems are. It was really heartening to have heard from the previous two talks that despite the obvious sensitivities, despite the obvious questions that those data sets pose, those were resolved in order to achieve really compelling and beneficial outcomes, both in terms of the academic innovation that's taking place, but as well as the operational benefits for the data owners themselves. Sometimes those benefits, again, as Nicole sort of intimated, they're not really very clear up front and in some respects unanticipated. Data being a means to identify not only answers, but also, in some respects, identifying some of the questions that were hitherto never really addressed in a systematic fashion. But there are a whole range of reasons why organisations don't share data. This is our experience, and this is something that we seek to be as empathetic about and supportive and offer the right reassurances. And clearly, lack of capacity to make data available is a big consideration. It's not a straightforward process to prepare, to describe, to share data, to come up with data sharing agreements and to invest in the legal and other services within an organisation to achieve that. There are many perceptions of risk around data, and often where the benefits aren't necessarily foremost and completely clear, sometimes the natural instinct can be to say, well, the risks, well, there's a privacy risk here, let's not bother taking that risk because the benefits are not sufficiently evident. Sometimes, and perhaps this is most clear when we're working with commercial organisations, there can be a perceived conflict between making data available and a business model which may be based upon the provision for a charge of data. So how can we resolve some of those concerns and convince data-owning organisations that there are other kinds of benefits that will come from an open data or a more accessible approach to making data available? And there can be fears too that sometimes the research results may not actually cast the data-owning organisation in a great light. What if, for example, North Lanarkshire had been proved to be not as wonderfully sort of equitable in their response to requests from different genders? So these are questions, again, legitimate questions, and our job as a data service is to convince organisations, well, that the benefits are really, really compelling too. Establishing the credibility of organisations' data as a robust evidence base, again, that's something that can be good and will in turn benefit the organisation themselves. Facilitating potentially beneficial analysis. Often there's a moral obligation we can describe, perhaps, that data often emerging from within the public sector, they remain a public good, and sort of we're trying to promote this idea of a digital commons whereby data within the public sphere should be more accessible to researchers and other kinds of interested organisations. The Open Knowledge Foundation, which sort of basically develops an agenda around the value of open access to data, has presented a number of these benefits, and indeed they apply just as much to more open data as much as they do to genuinely kind of open data. So offering things like transparency and democratic control, participation, engagement with services and with organisations, self-empowerment, improved and new private products and services, so building economic innovation around data's availability. Obviously, improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of government services is something that hopefully resonates with today and is evident from the presentations we've already heard. Impact measurement of policy. So again, Mark's work is very much around looking at this avenues investment within Glasgow and trying to harness as many data sources that reveal real insights and provide real evidence of the success of these investments, and hopefully success that we can measure on an ongoing basis and inform the continued investment in these pieces of infrastructure as they take place. And new knowledge from combined data sources and patterns in large data volumes. So again, combining data we know can really exponentially increase the value of individual data sets. We see that just simply from combining the North Lanarkshire data with some of to lend it sort of spatial characteristics, for example, and begin to see how these things are distributed spatially. So I'm going to kind of close more on a series of kind of open questions, really, which would invite you to kind of reflect on some extent in the sessions that follow. But how, as sort of a data service who is really saying, please give us your data, we will find an audience, we will amplify its availability and its accessibility, and that will translate to benefits for the data-owning organisations. But how can we communicate these benefits? How can we incentivize public sector organisations to make their data available? And what are the main drawbacks associated with doing so? And how might we, in partnership, sort of resolve some of those or offer appropriate reassurances associated with those? How might we, as an organisation, seek to influence regulators and all tiers of government to promote a more open data agenda? We've been discussing, for example, working with other similar data services to offer a collective perspective. These benefits we feel very earnestly about and believe in greatly. How do we ensure that there's an assumption in favour of a more open data agenda from organisations? And then, with an eye on the costs associated with making data available, how might we develop data services to not only be a supplier of data or a promoter of data's availability, but also how might we work with data owning organisations to actually facilitate data sharing and to inform their own data management and their own internal processes to make data sharing a more straightforward and a more intuitive and a more obvious outcome when data is being stockpiled and built up in such scales within these organisations. So that was really what I wanted to say on this. So it was more a series of a little bit of a brief overview of what we're doing as a data service, and sort of remind you that we offer these services and we're desperate for data and to be able to find an audience for that data.